Even though President Trump likes to say he's a huge supporter of the LGBTQ community, we all know that actions speak louder than words. And the National Center for Transgender Equality is keeping track of the administration's policies in regards to that community. Those policies are scrolling down your screen right now. They've banned transgender people from the military, withdrawn Department of Education guidance aimed at protecting transgender students. They're trying to roll back rules prohibiting discrimination of transgender people in homeless shelters. The president has even threatened to veto a House bill that would extend civil rights protections to people in the workplace based upon their sexual orientation or gender identity. Hard to believe that that battle is still being fought in the year 2019, but it still is. And this next one has resulted in a litany of lawsuits. The Health and Human Services Department has just announced a proposed rule that would dramatically expand the situations in which healthcare providers and insurers could refuse to provide service or pay for service. It's doing it under the guise of religion, saying they can decide to withhold the money or the care if it violates their religious beliefs. It's a religious freedom argument. My next guest represents the lead group that is suing those policy changes. Jamie Gliksberg is a senior attorney at Lambda Legal. Jamie, this HHS conscience rule that you and Lambda Legal are working to fight, first of all, aren't there any laws governing this? I mean, I know medical information is supposed to remain private and protected. I guess I just always assumed that sexual identity and orientation would be protected as well, isn't it?
So basically what this rule does is it takes statutes that have been relied upon for decades now and misapplies them. It invites healthcare workers to impose their religious beliefs on patients and arbitrarily deciding to whom they can provide care and who they decide to decline care to. It specifically targets reproductive health care for women and gender-affirming care for transgender patients and empowers virtually any healthcare worker, someone even tangentially related to the healthcare services, to deny care to these already vulnerable populations.
Does it allow a healthcare worker to ask about your sexual orientation, or is it, I mean, I know this sounds a lot like don't ask, don't tell, but is it just if they find out during casual conversation they can deny you service, or is there not enough clarity in that rule, or does it make a difference?
While it doesn't address specifically a question that might be asked, what it says is for any religious basis, a healthcare worker can deny care. And that's everyone from the person answering the phone at the ER to the person who's preparing the janitorial service, who might be preparing the room for a procedure. So it's been extended far more broadly than any of these religious protections were ever intended to be applied.
You know there are going to be some people who are watching this and hearing this and thinking to themselves, what's the big deal? If a doctor doesn't want to treat you because you're gay or you're a lesbian, go find a doctor who is willing to treat you. What's your response?
First, the stigma and dignitary harm from a person being denied health care is something that can't even be quantified. When people are denied health care, they are a lot less likely to seek health care out of fear of future discrimination. So a lot of people will not seek care, which will result in harm not only to their health, but to public health at large when they're not receiving treatment and preventative care. And it will also result in, if people do seek care, they're going to arrive at healthcare facilities in more acute conditions. And there's no emergency exception in this rule, meaning somebody who is literally about to die, who walks into an emergency room, could potentially, under this rule, be denied life-saving care because that person does not want to treat a transgender person or a woman because they might have sometime in their medical history received care that incidentally affected their reproductive function.
That's really surprising, only because we've always been told that, you know, an emergency room can't deny you treatment. If you've been shot, they have to treat you whether you can pay or not. But you're saying this rule would allow them to deny somebody because of their gender or sexual orientation?
The rule certainly invites that type of discrimination. When people asked in comments prior to publication of the final rule what would happen in an emergency situation, the Trump administration said we'll deal with that on a case-by-case scenario. And yes, you're absolutely correct. This is in direct conflict with existing medical standards of care and ethical standards of care that healthcare providers are expected to and legally required to abide by in providing care to patients.
Is this rule just health providers, or does health insurance get into this, and whether you could be denied coverage? Because once you start getting insurance companies involved, then you start potentially getting employers involved and things get really close to home.
It's a very scary reality because it's anyone tangentially connected to care, to anything that could be incidentally related to. And so that tangential connection means that we don't know how broadly this could be affected, but what we certainly do know is that it will empower people to think that they have a right to discriminate and will result in a tremendous amount of denials of care and discrimination against marginalized populations.
Lambda Legal has been involved in a number of cases against this administration as some of the anti-LGBTQ policies and particularly anti-trans policies have been rolled out. Things like the transgender military ban. I mean, give me an idea of the other things that Lambda Legal is working on.
We are working on a case right now in D.C. where a same-sex couple was denied the right to even apply to be foster parents under a federally funded program, meaning a program using taxpayer dollars, because they, quote, did not mirror the Holy Family. And for no other reasons. So we're suing the Department of Health and Human Services, the same department that we are bringing a lawsuit against in this case, stating that they cannot use federal dollars to determine who can and cannot participate in a federal program, that's a government's endorsement of religion and, of course, discrimination. But that is, just like in this case, the government deciding to preference one set of religious beliefs over others at the harm of marginalized communities.
The one question I keep coming back to is why? Why does this administration seem to be targeting this community in general, and particularly trans people, so much when they seem to have to go out of their way to do so? I know this isn't technically a legal question or a lawyer's question, but I'm curious what your answer is.
Well, these types of rules purport to be protecting conscience rights, specifically in this context, healthcare providers. But what we really know is the real aim is to circumvent anti-discrimination laws and discriminate against populations that are already vulnerable under the disguise of protecting conscience rights. But especially in, for example, this case, there has always been protections for people's religious-based objections to certain treatments. But this administration is targeting vulnerable populations simply to discriminate and harm those patients.
They certainly are. Well, best of luck to you and to Lambda Legal in your efforts. Jamie Gliksberg is a senior attorney with Lambda Legal. Jamie, appreciate a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, we're going to pivot to some presidential politics. Democrats are focusing on Iowa, the site of the first nominating contest. We got some new numbers that'll tell us where things stand just 2 weeks now before the first debates.